Welcome the next talk, bringing transparency to global ocean governance. And we welcome again His Excellency President Grimson from Iceland.
Good morning, Jeff. Why don't you go ahead and set this off and introduce yourself and set us going.
Sure. Thank you, Christina. First of all, just double checking. Everyone can hear me fine then? Yes?
Great.
Okay, great. So as usual, Christina and I both are famous for our presentations where we try to put too much into a single presentation. And now they've asked us to do this both in one presentation. So all I can say is be ready for a motion picture show. These slides are going to go by very quickly. We have a lot to say, but I also hope that we will have some time at the end for questions. And so please just allow us to go through this as fast as we can. Let's just get right into the overview of the presentations, and then I'll pass it over to Christina. So next slide. And as you can see, Christina is going to give you a blitz outline of ocean governance as it stands and where it might be going. And then I'm going to present again very quickly some of the outcomes that we've had on a year's research project studying the transparency of the existing governance institutions. Over to you, Christina.
Okay, we just have the screen go blank. That's all right. Anyway, what I'm here today to talk about is to celebrate progress as well as to emphasize some of the challenges we still have ahead. It's so exciting to be here in the midst of all these brilliant people because my father-in-law was in the Okesola pool who was sort of the first to start to look at how do you apply these new technologies already in the 60s and 70s for the concepts of freedom and concepts of sustainable development. So I'm very interested in how we can do this to move forward in the area that I've been looking at, which is the 50% of the planet that's beyond national jurisdiction. Just to put things into context, many of us grew up with Jacques Cousteau, who said that in this century, we're beginning to realize we don't just fight to survive, fight nature to survive, we also need to protect it. This, of course, was in the 1900s, 20th century. Governments are starting to realize this today. It is very exciting. Secretary of State John Kerry is planning our Oceans Summit. Right now in the Netherlands, there's a conference, Ocean Action Summit, that's convened by the World Bank, FAO, and the government of the Netherlands, the Global Ocean Commission. 17 high-level politicians are coming together to release their recommendations for moving forward in June. So there's a lot of attention to the ocean. But as we saw yesterday in the Washington Post, what we're doing is really just an eyedropper in a sea of problems of growing ocean acidification, of growing islands of trash, of overfishing, but also loss of biodiversity, loss of ecosystem functioning and stability, as well as loss of the creatures that make up the ocean and its ecosystems and diversity. So as I said, half the planet is beyond national jurisdiction. That's 2/3 of the ocean that are beyond direct control of nation states. What this means in terms of governance, this is the aerial view or space view of the maps that Paul was showing us earlier today in terms of the Law of the Sea Convention has adopted the zonal approach, where states have greatest jurisdiction closest to shore. By the time you reach 200 nautical miles, it then becomes the high seas. The concepts of high seas freedoms prevail. But what we've also seen in the past 15 years now is a growing scientific awareness and understanding that species don't recognize political boundaries, that ecosystems don't recognize political boundaries. How many have seen this map before? This was one of the great visualizations of the Census of Marine Life, results of 10 years scientific investigations of what the patterns of abundance, distribution, and diversity across all parts of the ocean. And what Barb was telling about yesterday is that some of these species are going back and forth across the ocean. That's on monthly and yearly bases, some even more frequently than that. So we need to look at this as a much larger global ocean basin scale issue. And what we've got is the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, an instrument that was developed and agreed in 1982. It's calling for it's recognizing that the problems of ocean space are interconnected and need to be treated as a whole. But what it does in practice is subdivide, allocate responsibility for high seas, fisheries, seabed mining, and shipping into specific international organizations or regional organizations. But as a result, this big blue and all the species that live in there often slip through the cracks or get left out of the map, out of the picture. And essentially, when you start to look at how do you manage a vast global commons, we can learn from the lessons of those like Elinor Ostrom, who have been studying very small-scale common problems. And essentially, what she has been saying, if you're going to succeed in managing your patch of green grass or something as vast as the high seas, is you need to have a sense of shared responsibility, common principles, duties, obligations. At the same time, you need to have mechanisms for collective action, where people start to work together in order to achieve specific aims. The number you need involved depends on the size of your commons. At the same time, you have rules, you have a sense of responsibility. You also have to have mechanisms for effective monitoring, surveillance, and enforcement. We used to have ability to walk across your green pastures in order to see whose cows were there that weren't supposed to be there. Now, we really need the tools that you're developing here in order to keep a better eye on what is going on in our global commons. But what we do have is not a black hole of ocean space, but unfortunately we have a fragmented system. It's a bit like the space debris that's out there that starts to deflect effective action. I've just been working on a project where we're looking at global ocean architecture, identified 100 different agreements that affect how we manage areas beyond national jurisdiction or the pollution that can indeed reach areas beyond national jurisdiction. There's no real sense of hierarchy. Each of these organizations is active in their own specific sphere, specific activity, and as many say, their own silos. So I've started to try to look at things on a place-based focus, trying to narrow in on, okay, how can you address these problems in one specific area? Yesterday we heard Joao talk a little bit about what they're doing in various places in the Azores, in the Sargasso Sea, and even Mozambique. So I've been privileged to be part of this initiative in the Sargasso Sea, trying to gain international recognition for a very special, unique ecosystem based on this brown sargassum seaweed that gives host to a fascinating ecosystem of little anglerfish and seahorses, and also a nursery for a huge variety of species that swim, sail, and float across the ocean, as well as the eels that swim from both European side and European, North America, Africa to come spawn in the center of the Sargasso Sea. But what we've seen is that it's filled with the path to progress. It's filled with obstacles because you can't get a place on the agenda at the International Maritime Organization. The Regional Fisheries Management Organization say, thank you very much for your information. We'll get back to you in 2 years with a progress report, and maybe we'll take a decision in 3 years. And even if you do make progress, well, we did recently have a signing of a formal ceremony in Bermuda of 5 governments coming together to say we are going to collaborate at the International Maritime Organization, at the Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, to try to get some of these measures through. But even if you succeeded, you're still only dealing with part of the problem. This is a map of areas that have been recognized through a series of scientific workshops as being of ecological and biological significance. It's just a first run at the information that is currently available, building on the decade of research of Census and Marine Life, as well as efforts within national governments to date. But we've got more than 48 places that have been identified, and some of these are truly vast. How do you start to draw international attention to the need for collective action and responsibility for maintaining the biodiversity and ecosystem functioning inside? So what many of us are now thinking is that if you've got this global problem, the ocean is interconnected, we truly do need a global level solution. And that, for most of us, is inside the halls of the United Nations. It's the only body where sectoral interests of fishing, shipping, seabed mining, or even conservation do not predominate, but you have potential for a balance of points of view in order to move forward. And so what we've been proposing now, and has been under discussion for the past 7 years, in fact, is a possibility for a new international agreement for high seas biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. That this would be under part of the Law of the Sea Convention. The Law of the Sea Convention already has 2 implementing agreements on highly migratory and straddling fish stocks, as well as with respect to seabed mining. So it would fit under the umbrella of the Law of the Sea Convention and fill in the holes with respect to that 3rd pillar of sustainable development, which is economic sustainability, also environmental sustainability. And what Jeff's going to be talking about is really the social equitable aspects of this ocean, this 50% of the planet that is our collective responsibility. We also need to know what is going on. So in terms of shared responsibility, looking at new principles, commitments for health, integrity, and resilience of the marine environment, looking at better ways to more equitably share in the benefits of marine resources, marine genetic resources in particular, and how do you actually implement precaution? We've been talking about precaution for many years, but the one thing that the Census of Marine Life did emphasize, well, too, is we are increasing our understanding rapidly, but we're also increasing our humility, humbleness rapidly as well in terms of how much we don't know and how much we need to know in the context of increasing impacts of climate change and ocean acidification. So we need the basis for collective action, establishment of marine protected areas, capacity building, prior assessments of what your impacts are going to be, and then also the effective capacity for effective enforcement, verification, trusting nations are going to do the right thing, but also having the tools and technologies to verify. And with that, I'm happy to say that at the United Nations, we have, as I said, been under these discussions, but stimulated by the global gathering of heads of states and leaders at Rio de Janeiro in 2012. Governments are on the verge of saying, let's go ahead and launch these negotiations. But there was a small handful of governments that said, well, wait, we need to understand more about what we're launching into. So they set themselves a time frame, a target for a decision by August, September 2015. It's just a little bit over a year now. We now have a process at the United Nations, meeting beginning of this month, another one in June, to talk about what should an implementing agreement look like. What would be the scope? What sort of things do you want to cover? What sort of instruments, interactions would you have? What would it be doing? As well as for some, what are the political, economic feasibility factors that you need to be considered? So it's a really exciting moment where we have the attention of governments around the world. The G77 is in favor, the European Union is in favor, Australia, Mexico, New Zealand is in favor. You've got all but, as I said, still a handful of governments that have recognized the need for truly collective global level action. And of course, to complement projects like progress, like we have in the Northeast Atlantic, to build on those experiences, but to make sure that the entire planet can be addressed. So with that, I'll just say that we do have a growing number of non-governmental organizations, scientific organizations, in addition to the states and governments who are now in favor of this new agreement for high seas biodiversity conservation. But of course, there are many more steps to take. Is how do you realize the prospects of enforcing laws for marine protected areas, for better enforcement of fisheries regulations, and for moving forward on that global scale, passion and understanding of what is going on out there. So with that, I will pass it over to Jeff, who's now going to be looking at more intricate workings inside these existing organizations and help to underscore why we need this new transparency and understanding of global ocean governance. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Kristina, for the overview. Here's another diagram that's trying to show the same thing that Kristina's earlier slide did, which was some of the governance bodies and institutions that are responsible for the high seas. Now, I don't have time to explain this because it's a 20-minute presentation in itself. But in blue circles are the institutions that we looked at in our study of transparency of the current institutions. And we, I mean, the institute that I represent, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, based in Potsdam, Germany, and Duke University. Nicola Clark is a master's student there. We're working with colleagues at Duke University, Linwood Pendleton, and others. So next slide, if I may.
Yes, that or done.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So transparency in marine governance, we don't really know how long they were talking about it because documents before the early 90s are not readily available. But it clearly seemed to become a topic of conversation by the mid-1990s, as you can see by the white and black lines on this graph. And then since that time, it has sort of steadily leveled out. And we looked at their meeting documents, the main meeting documents for those organizations that were in the blue ovals on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So what were they saying in the context of transparency? Well, basically, many of the discussions have not moved very far. There's some exceptions to that, but a lot of the conversation is, oh, we should be more transparent about this or that. And in these bar graphs, you can see that the middle tone of gray represents this, we should be more transparent sentiment. Next slide, please. So, is should good enough? A look at some of the voluntary plans of action around fisheries. There's a code of conduct for responsible fisheries, and then 4 different international plans of action, as they're called, that the FAO developed with the FAO members. The FAO is the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And they, with fishing nations, developed a code of conduct as well as these international plans of action. Next slide, please. Well, how did it turn out? It's been about 14 years since the plans of action and 17 years since the code of conduct. And actually, it hasn't turned out very well. There's very little reporting on how well that they've implemented the plans of action, if at all. And 17 years after the code of conduct, only about half of the members reported that they had national legislation that was in conformity with this thing that they had negotiated. So clearly there's a problem here that voluntary measures, though well-intended, are only going so far. Next slide, please. So I have argued with many researchers that transparency is the issue here. That until the information is available for all to see, there will be no accountability. So until we actually know what different nations are doing, there's no way that they will feel accountable. And if they don't feel accountable, then probably the compliance levels are not going to be great. And if compliance is low, then obviously effectiveness suffers as well. So I've argued that transparency is the first link in a chain. It is by itself not sufficient to answer our governance problems, but it is a necessary first step. And with regard to transparency, we in our analysis broke it down to 3 stages, which I'll briefly go over with you. What goes into a decision-making process, that is the information, the scientific data, raw data, all that kind of stuff. The process itself, how they make their decisions. And then finally the outcomes. Were the objectives met? Was there surveillance? What was compliance like? How were sanctions levied against non-compliant states? So these 3 things: what goes in, what is the process itself, and what comes out. Next slide, please. So looking at the first stage, information sharing, I should point out that these scores, some of them are very generous. We have like a score for do they have a website? Do they list the regulations on the website? And the basic things like that, yes, most of the fishing organizations do. But for what I would view as some of the critical things, like do they provide scientific data so that we can peer review the science that they say they are making their decisions on? No. No, there is no way that you can peer review the science right now that goes into their decision making. But if a tuna commission says the tuna are doing well, we just have to take their word for it. Next slide, please. One area where the regional fisheries management organizations have really improved, I would say, is allowing observers into their meetings. 10 years ago, it was very unusual to be able to attend an RFMO meeting, and now, by and large, it's okay. You can get in. You have to be part of the delegation, I should say, just not any old member of the public. But you can find maybe an NGO like Greenpeace, like WWF, or others that are attending the meetings. But I should also point out that a minority of members can generally block it. So if they don't like you, usually all it takes is one complaint from one member state, and then you're not allowed in. Even if the majority, even if 99% say that you're okay. Next slide, please. With regard to reporting on outcomes, it was all over the board. Some, like NAFO, North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, are pretty good and report on their compliance, for example. You may be wondering about the red X next to the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization. That's not meant to be bad. That's just to say that they shouldn't be considered in this analysis because they're very young. They're just getting started off and they haven't had time to report. So that's why they have such a low score. But overall, very mixed reporting, and overall, it's very hard to find out if the parties were in compliance or not. Next slide, please. So, just to sum up, which is actually 2 papers worth of material here, so it's pretty fast, is the RFMOs do different things well and different things poorly, so they can learn from one another. So just bringing all those siloed organizations together would be of great value, because they could actually learn from each other's good practices. The second point is that observers and civil society participation is indeed improving. However, and these are pretty big howevers, access to the scientific data is still really, really hard to get. Access to the vessel movements themselves, whether it's the vessel monitoring systems or other systems, is really hard. We don't know where they're fishing unless they want to tell us. And then finally, it's really hard to determine the compliance levels. We just don't know how well they're doing their job. So really, the only way that you, Joe Q. Public, or Jane Q. Public, can figure out if our fisheries or our deeps, our shipping, or in the future mining resources are being properly managed is you either A, take their word for it, or B, you gotta go to the meetings and really make it your career, like Kristina, myself, and many others have done. Next slide, please. So I would argue that that is not the best way to engage civil society. If we want to have transparency, if we want the public to be concerned about what's going on out there, we have to make it easier for them to see what's going on out there. And this is a Google meeting. You may notice there's a lot of Google things on this slide. I'm inspired by Google acquiring Titan Aerospace. My goodness, these are high-endurance drones that could be up there for days or weeks over our oceans, taking pictures, sending back pictures of who's fishing where. The Loon project, which is to do internet hookups in places where it's hard to get internet. Why not have some videos on there over the ocean? Why not have a look at what the vessels are doing? We accept public surveillance in public places as just part of modern life. I don't think we like it. I don't think any one of us like it, but I think we accept it. We accept this is a price that we pay in the public sphere because it's for the better good. You don't want bad things to happen. And I would argue that this is the same logic that's true in our oceans. That, it's nice that fishermen say that it's all private and secret out there, but actually I don't buy the argument. It's a public commons, it's a public resource, and we need to know what's going on out there. And I would say that in this case, the public good outweighs the private need for privacy. We're not going into anyone's bedrooms here. We're talking about the oceans. We're talking about the seas where people are shipping, mining, and fishing. And these resources that they're using are for the common heritage of mankind. They're not just for themselves. And I would argue that morally as well as legally, we have a mandate and we have a responsibility to better understand what's going on out there. Next slide, please. Some of you may have picked up this story. Loch Ness Monster was discovered on Apple. Of course, it would have to be the Apple maps, wouldn't it? You know? Of course, it wasn't the Loch Ness Monster. It was just the way that the images of satellites were overlaid. It started to look like a big fish. But what's really interesting here is how many people found it, how many people were interested. If we had access to this kind of information on the web 24/7, I would argue that the way that fisheries and everything else happens on this planet would change radically. Radically. Everyone on their Android, and maybe even their iPhones, who knows, but everyone on their Android would be onto the case, and you know, what more could you ask for? Last slide, please. So, I want to thank you for your time, and just to highlight with this little slide that it's not just fisheries, that there is a gold rush going on right now, and the next big thing in the 3 to 5 years, it's going to be deep sea mining. So the issues that I discussed around fisheries could, if we're not careful, repeat themselves again with regard to deep sea mining, unless we start to change the way that we consider and treat our common property resources. Thank you very much.
We have time for 2 questions. Who's brave enough?
Who controls the like where deep sea mining is allowed, and then who pays for this extra hours and tailings or
Jennifer's asking who controls where people can mine in the deep sea and who is controlling where tailings are going to be dumped. That's right now there is interest both within and beyond national jurisdiction. Jeff, do you want to tackle within national jurisdiction, and I'll do beyond? This is sort of 2 questions.
Yeah, it depends on the individual states, the individual countries. Because mining is such a new thing, most of them don't have legislation in place. And deep sea mining is particularly hot right now in the South Pacific. And honestly, most of those countries don't even have the laws in place. So they're starting now to develop those laws. It's actually a European Union funded project to help them develop laws. And so now is really a golden time for those of us interested in this topic to help set what are the good standards. What should we expect?
And then one of the chief technological tasks is how do you monitor plumes emitted into ocean space, this huge water column? How do you monitor what is going on board the ships as they are taking in the resources and then grinding it up, and as you say, where the tailings is going to be discharged? Right now there's a huge loophole in international law, is that they assume the International Seabed Authority, which was established under the Law of the Sea Convention, to monitor and administer seabed mining beyond national jurisdiction, but they exempted the discharge of tailings, assuming that this would be governed by another organization. So it's again this mismatch. The good news is that under the Law of the Sea Convention, the seabed and its mineral resources were designated as part of the common heritage of mankind, and this International Seabed Authority was charged with developing rules and regulations for their exploration and exploitation. But the International Seabed Authority is not this overarching group of wise elders, but it is part of the state governments who have an interest in developing seabed resources. The benefits, the economic benefits, are supposed to be shared by all states, so everybody has an interest in the exploitation. And our challenge today is really how do we make sure that the voice of those who are not going to directly profit from the economic side of development of seabed resources have a say in what happens to the living common heritage of all of us on the planet. So it's a new frontier.
The UN Convention Law of the Sea deals with mineral resources on the sea floor. Areas like the hydrothermal vents